Welcome to Security Dilemma, a podcast by the John Quincy Adams Society. I'm A.J. Manuzzi, joined by my co-host John Gay, as we have a conversation today with Fulton Armstrong. Fulton's a writer and adjunct professor at American University, as well as Syracuse University's Maxwell School program here in D.C. Previously, he followed Latin America affairs for almost 30 years in a number of U.S. government positions, serving as senior professional staff member responsible for Latin America affairs on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, National Intelligence Officer for Latin America, Chief of Staff of the Director of Central Intelligence's Crime and Narcotics Center, Director for Inter-American Affairs at the National Security Council, and as a staffer in the U.S. House of Representatives in the legislative branch. In this conversation, we discuss Trump's Latin America policy and the latest on Venezuela, Cuba, and other hotspots throughout the region. Join us as we have a conversation with Fulton Armstrong. Fulton Armstrong, welcome to Security Dilemma.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
It's great to have you. You've followed U.S. foreign policy in Latin America for decades, in and out of government. How would you define and then rate the Trump administration's approach to the region that we're seeing play out today?
The Trump administration has really proudly proclaimed certain steps backward in our relationship with Latin America. It's really the Monroe Doctrine. Some of the people here in Washington are referring to it as the Donroe Doctrine to show the imprint he's putting on it. But I would say that part of our problem with Latin America is not just a Trump problem, or even a Republican problem. It's been basically both parties have never really learned in a sustained fashion as parties to how to deal with Latin America. Latin America, which is a fascinating and amazingly beautiful region with beautiful people, incredible ethnic diversity, great food, great football, soccer players, the greatest, and great dance and great, in some places, great cigars and things like that. But Americans have never really fully appreciated, writ large, North Americans, U.S. people, because, we're going to be talking about a region where everyone is an American. So it's not just, as we talk about this, it's not just the Trump administration had difficulty. We've had some presidents do brilliant things in Latin America, or at least improved things in Latin America. FDR in the 1930s did the Good Neighbor Doctrine. JFK in the 1960s launched the Alliance for Progress. Bill Clinton issued apologies for what the U.S. had done in Guatemala. Obama also apologized for things, including we did human experiments with people with syphilis. And that sort of stuff is good. But culturally, below the presidential level, there's not resonance. And the moment that they leave, we go back to status quo ante. And we're now basically reinstitutionalizing that status quo ante of the Monroe Doctrine.
Yeah, if you look at the Trump administration's national security strategy, in a couple of places, they talk about institutionalizing this approach. They say that they want to ensure that the Western Hemisphere remains reasonably stable and well-governed enough to prevent and discourage mass migration. We want a hemisphere whose governments cooperate with us against narco-terrorists, cartels, and other transnational criminal organizations. Importantly, for this point, we want a hemisphere that remains free of hostile foreign incursion or ownership of key assets and that supports critical supply chains. In other words, we will assert and enforce a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, perhaps based off of the Roosevelt corollary that we've talked about before on this podcast. And then they also say that we will deny non-hemispheric competitors the ability to position forces or threatening capabilities or to own or control strategically vital assets in our hemisphere. So insofar as this sort of Donroe Doctrine is articulated, that seems to be what the documents say. And it focuses on China. It doesn't say it explicitly, but it would seem to be aimed at China. As a former intelligence analyst who's followed this for a while, what do you describe as kind of the nature of China's presence in Latin America and the Caribbean, and how should we be thinking about it?
China is present in the hemisphere. We'll talk about that in just a second. Part of the thing you have to know is going back to the creation of the Monroe Doctrine in the 1820s. It was originally no Europeans in, quote, our hemisphere. But it became very clear very fast that what it was an argument for the U.S. to intervene when it wants, for the U.S. to do neo-colonialism. We get rid of the Spanish and the Portuguese, but then we sort of want to have the same sort of thing. And it gives us the authority to use, we think, authorization to use the big stick and to intervene even militarily and all of that. And I think that one could pull apart the argument that what the Monroe Doctrine or the Donroe Doctrine was intended to do was promote democracy, because actually what it does is promotes the oligarchs continuing the neo-colonialistic relationship with us, which suppresses democracy. When you suppress democracy, you are not creating greater stability over the long term. Short term, yes. But so democracy, stability, cooperation, what you wind up getting is cooperation from people through coercion, which isn't the kind of cooperation that the United States of America really wants. We want people that want to work with us on issues. On the China thing, as an analyst and as an American citizen, it's quite clear that China has made quite significant inroads into, quote, our hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere. But if you look at it, look at the chronology, and you look at the case by case by case, country by country by country, what you actually see is they wrestled nothing away from us. We walked off the field. We walk off the field, and they're more than happy to go in and get for a dime something that we might have already put a buck into. And we then curse them for coming into our territory, but we walked off the field. Where we have gone head to head with the Chinese, we do pretty well. But head to head means also that we deliver, because we have, of course, our conditions. And I think we have a consensus that we, the United States of America, it's fair for us to put conditions of certain transparency, certain accountability. But we all put all kinds of conditions on these measures. But also, even when they comply, we often don't deliver. So we walk off the field, or we're just not reliable partners. And the hemisphere needs to build its future. They need to build their economies. They need to build their nations. And we're not a reliable partner anymore. But would I prefer that the Chinese not have a brand new port in Peru? Well, perhaps I would. I would prefer that the Peruvians had a brand new port in Peru. But we walked off the field. So when you walk off the field, I think that you sort of surrender your right to complain.
Yeah, I am curious about public attitudes in these countries about the US and China. I mean, I think here in Washington, we're very focused on the great power politics of it all. But for individual people, especially given, as you mentioned, the United States' relationship with the oligarchs, with the landed class of Latin America. Martin Luther King, for example, in his Beyond Vietnam speech, referred to essentially the United States military as the paramilitary of the landed gentry of Latin America. But when we think about those people and what they're experiencing on a day-to-day basis, in very conditions of inequality, what might matter is less sort of the great power politics of it all, but can I afford an electric vehicle, whether it's Chinese or American or what have you? What do we know about public attitudes and polling in these countries about the image of the United States and China?
There are polls. I haven't read any recent ones, but one has also anecdotal information and long-standing relationships that we might have because we worked on Latin America in the region. I think we can make a couple of, they're sort of gross, but they are generalizations, but they are, I think, defensible. One is that the people who like us the most are the people who manipulate us the most. The oligarchs, the elites, the rich people, who also tend to be the whiter people, and the people who visit Disney World and whose kids come up to American universities, and they wrap their fingers around us, or sometimes around our necks, and they're in charge of this relationship. They please us. They also make our embassies feel okay staying in the diplomatic bubble. Because when you serve overseas, as I have, you have to make an effort to get out of the bubble, to get out of the gringo handler's grip and talk to real people. And those people tend to be a little bit poorer, a little bit browner, a little bit less courteous when criticizing the United States, but they're actually the people who strive to achieve what their counterparts, their family members, etc., in the United States have achieved. They want the American car. They want American sorts of things, but they feel that we are always pushing them away in favor of basically the wealthy white elites who speak our language and dance with us better than they do.
What about recent events like the Venezuela and Iran interventions? Have you seen any sort of impact from that on the ground in these countries in particular and their image of the United States and how they see the United States?
The metrics are right now still not available. I mean, that you could say polls and things like that. There is one metric that you can look at, and you can see it either in short-term context or in long-term context, and that is that just as 10, 15 years ago, we had what we called the pink wave, and that is that people were dumping center-right or right-wing governments who hadn't fulfilled their promises, and they were moving toward left or center-left sorts of administrations. And now that the center-left and left have failed, they're swinging back over to the right. And if you look at it, it's a very impressive list of quite hard right presidents, some of whom one could reasonably challenge their commitment to democratic values. The most outstanding one, and our best buddy, is President Milei in Argentina. I mean, I think he's quite widely known as Trump's mini-me in the hemisphere. And to solidify the relationship, Trump offered for him, he had some midterm type elections, said that if you re-elect Milei's people for another term, I will give you $30 billion. And he did, which is a kind of U.S. intervention, a little bit unseemly, and it reinforces the view of the people outside the elites that the U.S. is being unfair. In the case of Chile, for example, you had a widely discredited president coming out, but they elected a very hard right president who has never criticized the human rights violation of, for example, the Pinochet government. So in broad terms, remember that when you look at government names, and of course you have Bukele in Central America, you have the new Hondurans, the new Costa Rican is also moving things over to the right. In Ecuador, in all of these countries, except a couple, and we're all, I think, pretty much expecting Colombia to also move over to the right in their elections later this year, that those you'd think that was an expression from Latin Americans of support for what we're doing, the Monroe, Donroe, etc. But I would argue that most Latin Americans who did not have much affection for Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela and don't really think that the Cuban economic model is sustainable or has served the Cuban people well, that in their hearts they will see, as I think many good U.S. analysts do, that what we did in Venezuela, which was a military attack on the government, and some people would say the kidnapping, the illegal unilateral kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro, whether you like him or not, there is a thing called international law, and there's also just the concept of decency, that though that military attack and rendition of the president was a desperate solution to an absolutely failed policy. I was on the ground, I was in the White House, in other words, when Hugo Chavez was elected in 1998, and he took office in 1999, and he came to the White House during that period of time as president-elect. And we said, and we actually told the interagency, don't make this guy our enemy. He's the authentic nationalist, and he will whoop us if we try to take him on and undermine him in his own country and his own turf and all that. And so what we had then was a series of failures where U.S. bureaucrats were at the forefront of that effort to constantly be undermining Chavez when the opposition, which we were heavily subsidizing, would call him, they'd use the Spanish word, a monkey or an ape. We wouldn't criticize them. we were signaling repeatedly that you can do whatever you want. And over the years, whether it was against Chavez or Maduro, we supported at least 6 failed coups. We didn't necessarily originate all of them. We did originate some, but we condoned it. What you're signaling when you're the United States of America is that we will intervene to get what we want in these countries. And so what you have then, this return to the Monroe Doctrine, is for many, many Latin Americans, and I think even among the elites, they find it quite insulting, but it's much more profitable to be our little buddies down there rather than to push back. I think that they also believe in their sovereignty. They want to have their nationalist dignity and things like that. And our policies, like in Venezuela, and we could also talk about the really significant deepening of the U.S. embargo against Cuba in recent years. And unfortunately, Joe Biden and his staff did not change practically anything from Trump 1. They actually made some things worse by not waiving certain things that, if you want to go into details, we can, that really have hurt Cuba. But now we can really say, with the exception of 2 shipments, little shipments, of oil from Putin, probably because Putin had a personal interest in that, we let those 2 shipments go through. And also to debunk the allegations that what we're really seeing in Cuba is a blockade now, because we have stopped ships from going in there. That the most Latin Americans, even among the elites, even though they don't dare say so, find that this is pretty atrocious. But they think we can ride this out because the Americans will choose a new president in a couple of years and we'll then get a fresh start. But I'm not sure they're going to get the fresh start.
Hey folks, exciting news. The John Quincy Adams Society is pleased to announce its 2026 summer conference for early career professionals and college students. Participants spend 4 days engaging with thinkers, practitioners, and scholars. It's an opportunity to step back and examine some of the big, fundamental questions about American foreign policy at a time when those questions are more pressing than ever. With major transformations underway in the U.S. national security space, policy shapers in all parts of the political spectrum will need to feel comfortable talking not only about tactics and tools, but also about goals and ends. The 2026 conference will proceed in 2 major parts. First, our participants will talk grand strategy, a state's theory of how to cause security for itself. This Morgenthau Grand Strategy Seminar centers on small seminar-style discussions with rising international affairs scholars, conducted in partnership with the University of Notre Dame's O'Brien Notre Dame International Security Center. The program bears the name of acclaimed realist IR scholar Hans J. Morgenthau. Participants come away with a richer understanding of what grand strategy is, theories that can animate grand strategies, and applications in key regions and issue sets. This comprises the first evening of the conference, the second full day, and most of the third day of the summer conference. Second, participants will dive into policy and practice. They'll take part in a crisis simulation that puts them in the shoes of key decision makers. They'll hear from bipartisan panels of experts on pressing topics in U.S. national security, including dissections of the latest conflicts and their meaning for U.S. strategy and security. They'll connect with professionals who can share secrets of success, and they'll do all this in a cohort of their future peers, current and aspiring U.S. foreign policy professionals. This comprises the third evening and the closing 4th day of the conference. If you're interested in applying for the 2026 summer conference, don't miss out. Go to jqas.org/2026-summer conference. We'll post the link in the show notes, and we look forward to looking over your application. Thank you, and now back to the show.
So I'm a Middle East guy, so I'd like you to correct or amend my kind of big theory of the region, or at least kind of what I hear from other people, which is, kind of as you alluded to, there's a big, what you might call left-right division in Latin America that, is tied to a lot of inequality. There's also a kind of racial component. It's often tied to who has, wealth or power in industry. And that narrative one hears in Washington is basically the governments of the right are friendlier to U.S. interests, including things like, the presence of U.S. business in the region, that the governments of the left are unfriendly to U.S. interests, and that, if you're, a State Department official who's trying to do right by a U.S. citizen-owned business that has an interest in Latin America, you're going to have more problems dealing with the government under a left-wing government than a right-wing government, and that the region is kind of divided into left and right, and that therefore there are blocks of states that we can almost understand the region to have a coherence geopolitically along left and right lines, and that that the interest of the United States is to deepen its partnerships with the right-wing countries and undermine the left-wing countries, and that the region sees itself that way too, that the left-wing countries see themselves as buddies, the right-wing countries see themselves as buddies. Tell me what I've got wrong there.
Well, I think the last thing, the right-wing governments don't necessarily see their neighbors as buddies. They stab each other in the back, probably more than the left-wing buddies stab their buddies in the back. I think you're right. I would, left and right is difficult words, even when you compare the U.S., the way we use the words, the way Europe does, what we consider to be a conservative in many cases is, in Europe, considered to be far right. And what a lot of Europeans might be moderates, we would consider far left. I mean, if you took the agenda of everything who's our most left-wing person, probably Bernie Sanders might be the most systematically thing. But if you put Bernie Sanders in Europe, he's a total centrist, and maybe on some things even center-right. So we have to be careful of the vocabulary. But you're right that the so-called left-wing tend to be much more inclusive, be looking out, for example, more for indigenous rights, that if you want to go in and do extractive industries, mining, oil, things like that, they're going to say, you have to take care of our people. There has to be a tax that gives them, you have to protect the environment. Whereas the so-called right in these countries are not nearly so inclusive and not nearly so concerned about the minority rights, or in case, majority rights. Because in some of these countries, the indigenous, or certain regions, of course, the indigenous are the majority. And so what you have is people that almost become co-conspirators with us and with U.S. industry to basically trample upon the rights of local people. It's not always that way. On the other hand, there are some so-called left-leaning people whose concept of democracy or human rights might not be all that pretty for us. The big difference is the right wing does it. I mean, if you look at the most gross human rights violations in Latin America, in my lifetime, my longer lifetime than yours, what you can see is that the right has done incredible human rights violations, but we don't hold them as accountable. And like in the case of Milei and the case of Cast in Chile, there's a denial, and we don't mind that. And in the case, whereas the Democrats up here have apologized for our alignment with the right, and whether it was in Argentina or Central America. And so I think that what you have here is a double standard. One could even say that on Venezuela, one reason that it became so polarized inside the country or inside the region, and I'm saying that they really were not big fans of Maduro, but Chavez was a regional leader, was that the human rights violations that had taken place in Colombia during the presidency of Álvaro Uribe, when they had the so-called false positives. I don't know how much you might know about the false positives, but these are young men and boys recruited for jobs, and the jobs that sometimes they were pitched, the mothers and grandmothers were pitched to send their sons to these jobs, and later they were simply executed dressed up in FARC uniforms, guerrilla uniforms, so that the military could say that they had killed X number. And in the beginning, when these first started breaking, we thought the number might have been 800, 1,000, but there are now, I think, 6,000 certified cases. Chavez might not have been an angel on human rights, and Maduro was not an angel on human rights. But we criticized them for every minor infraction. But we never went after Uribe or his successors. We never demanded accountability. We barely supported the people inside the country that demanded some accountability. So if you say left and right, you have to be careful that our double standards also accentuate that. To use the word, maybe it's inaccurate, maybe I'll regret saying it, is that we basically conspire with the right to do certain things that we would never collaborate with the left on, including covering up human rights abuses. That answer your question?
Yeah, well, and I mean, I'll tell you, as a Middle East guy, I had not heard about that Uribe false positives thing. I'll have to do some reading on that.
great
I'm not
reporting.
making it up.
I'd like,
I'm
yeah,
not
and I
making.
mean, I'd like to think I'm reasonably well informed, and so I'm like, oh wow, yeah,
I
yeah.
was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee staff, first with Biden and then with John Kerry. And we were among those who broke the story. And State Department was as deep in the cover-up of what was happening in Colombia. And it was because we love them. And we love them. And we didn't like Chavez and we didn't like Maduro. And so it's different. The other thing you might want to keep in mind is, we actively subsidize opposition political parties against the so-called leftist regimes. And what we do is we identify them. It's basically the process that we used to see quite all in the intelligence world, that you spot a talent, you assess the talent, you recruit the talent, you train the talent, and then you give the talent points. This is the objective, and you go off to the races. And so what we have here is we're so deeply involved in some of these countries. And you can see in the case of Venezuela that it blew up in our faces because Maria Corina Machado was not even good enough for the United States government to step in after we got rid of Maduro for them. Well, what kind of investment is that? So I cannot allege on the record that I knew that she wasn't, but her behavior was as our ally and so deeply allied with us that she even gave her medal to Donald Trump. So if you're going to look at left and right, you have to realize that we have our fingers on the scales in Latin America.
And specifically in the case of Colombia, Colombia was one of the top recipients of U.S. security assistance year after year in line with the war on drugs. Yeah.
$16 billion. And at the end of it, it was supposedly for anti-narcotics. At the end of it, Colombia was producing more coca leaf and exporting more cocaine to the United States than before.
A heck of a record. Similarly, I'm curious how durable you see a hemisphere strategy built on, as we've talked about, ideological friends and placating them while engaging in punitive pressure for adversaries, right? What happens when governments that we think align with us pursue interests that diverge from our own, or if they lose power? Is this kind of just a short-sighted 4-year, 2-year strategy, or can it be made into something that's actually more durable?
But more durable on as U.S. policy or on their policies?
More durable in terms of our policy, in terms of getting outcomes that are beneficial for U.S. national security interests.
Yeah. I mean, let's look at the model in the abstract first. What you're saying is that we applaud and reward the people who do what we want them to do, and we punish and sometimes even punish in the sense of isolate, criticize, etc., and sanction people who don't do what we want them to do. And that's what you're asking. And in the case of Colombia, we have examples that before Uribe, there was a President Samper. And Samper was one who said, look, this idea of doing eradication of coca, which destroys territory and also just forces the cocaleros to go to another place to plant, which means they're cutting down jungle and forest and all that to plant coca. So it's environmentally bad, politically bad. And Samper wanted to have somewhat of a softer view. We sanctioned him. What we call is decertified Colombia. And he was a bad boy. Of course, then later on come successors. I could have the chronology a little bit goofy in my mind right now, but certainly with Uribe, he said, yeah, let's eradicate. We would drop, Roundup. Glyphosate, is that what it's called technically? On big parts of the jungle, people would lose their jobs. Of course, they would have to move. There were also health implications. There were implications for the water as well. But that didn't matter. Go ahead and do it. And that was also one of the big expenses. There was a time when we would even say that the office at State Department that does this, it's called INL, had its own little Air Force and all. So yes, we have that. And then for sanctions, so we sanctioned Samper. We got very, very close to sanctioning the current president, Petro, of Colombia, because he didn't want U.S. military aircraft to bring back repatriated aliens and stuff, undocumented stuff. So he criticized us and made the airplanes go back or something. And so for that, okay, sanctions. And it was that in case it was tariffs. We're gonna sanction you. And in the case of Lula, the president of Brazil, who is an old also physically, left-leaning guy and stuff, because he would not intervene against the Constitution of Brazil, because he would not intervene to stop legal proceedings against Bolsonaro, his predecessor, and a Trump ally, because he wouldn't do an unconstitutional act, we threatened him with 100% tariffs. Is this a sustainable policy? Well, it wasn't even sustainable for the Trump people because they didn't do the 100% tariffs. But these threats and the things, it's just not good policy. I think I worked in policy in the White House for 4 years. I worked, of course, in the Senate. And before, when I was a young lad, I was in the House of Representatives where I did also some Latin America stuff. And these things are not good policy. The really effective policy is when we use our soft power, our strong example, our great institutions, or previously great institutions, to show people this is how we resolve our problems. And to be fair, faithful to our own rhetoric, including the rhetoric that we say about democracy, stability, cooperation, things. For us to be solid and steady in our own values is often the best policy, and to enforce sanctions only when we have to. We can do it, but we're impatient. And I think we started the discussion by saying that Americans, U.S. people, have never fully appreciated the richness of Latin America and the desire of this region. Yes, they want us to deal with them as sovereign equals, but the desire of this region to be a little bit special for us. We have common roots. We're all Americans. And yes, they were from Southern Europe and we were from Northern Europe, the predominant thing. So we're UK focused and they were Spain focused and Portugal focused and stuff. What they want is acceptance and partnership. And we have trouble delivering that. And we won't have good policy until we can figure that out.
Since you mentioned some of the things we've done in Colombia in support of the war on drugs, what would a good U.S. drug policy look like?
A good, we've been doing the so-called war on drugs since Richard Nixon. Okay, you guys were a little bit young when Richard Nixon was president.
I was negatively young, yeah.
I was in university, and even though Richard Nixon, because of Watergate and stuff, and because of his personality, is rarely cited as a great president, a lot of what Richard Nixon did was very, very good on U.S. domestic stuff, the EPA, clean water, clean air, a lot of really good things. On foreign policy, however, it wasn't that good. The so-called war on drugs later led to some really cool initiatives in the United States. Maybe you've seen this public service announcement where there's a hot frying pan with a little bit of oil in it, and they break an egg into it and say, this is your brain on drugs, to discourage use. And there was even some law enforcement efforts here in the United States, not just to go after the guy with a nickel bag or with a reefer in his pocket or something. It was actually to try to go after the infrastructure. Later on, as technology permitted, but also the freedom from true accountability increased, we increasingly made this a foreign war on drugs. And so we do things in Colombia, because Venezuela, just to make sure you understand, Venezuela, even though we accused Maduro of being a narco cartel, the cartel that we accused him of having doesn't even exist. And very little of the drugs that come to the U.S. ever pass through Venezuela. Okay. And he was neither was he a terrorist, neither was he the head of the gang, the Tren de
The
Aragua
Department
gang.
of Justice actually had to revise the
That's right.
indictment and take it out.
They had to take out the name of the cartel that they claimed he headed because it doesn't exist. Correct. Exactly. This war on drugs then was, let's get these people to destroy the coca. Let's get these people to stop the development of coca paste. Let's get these people to stop the transit. And so we were doing huge operations throughout Central America, through the Caribbean, and some over in the Pacific. And so huge operations, we call them interdiction operations. And then we developed these models that were, one of them was called the Kingpin, and the other one was called Linear. Kingpin is, let's kill the big narcos, the capos of the narcos. Let's do this. And analytically, I think I'm not violating any security here because it's been said a zillion times publicly and validated. So that you take off the head, you decapitate these organizations. They're Hydra. 10 heads grow back. And so it just doesn't work. And there were times where some pretty smart, pretty courageous heads of state, including, I remember one time, President Laura Chinchilla of Costa Rica, when Obama went down to Central America for a summit of just the Central Americans, and the Panamanians, I think, were there. And Laura said to him, hey, this is a little bit unfair. We are the ones that put in the money, the blood, the disruption of our neighborhoods, our police getting fired at by these people, etc. And what are you doing? And I have to sympathize a little bit because when I looked at drugs, you say when I did drugs, but I didn't do drugs. When I looked at drugs and watched the counter-narcotics world, the DEA would always come up, like up on Capitol Hill, with these maps, with these great big fat arrows that were pointing from the northern tier, the Andean region, the producers of coca, Andean region, these big fat things, and some of it goes over here, these big arrows. Then every arrow stopped at the U.S. border, whether in Mexico or along the Gulf of Mexico and all that. And we would say, in our official capacity of oversight, because it was the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, saying, where are the arrows inside the U.S.? And they actually would say, there are no cartel activities, structured cartel activities, and there's no infrastructure, I think is what they said, that we have identified. You say, wait a second. The logistics of delivering to, I think they had said back then, 300 different markets, the logistics, the personnel, the security that they would have to get drug to market, and then importantly, get the cash back down to the border. And then the weapons that we were providing, American citizens were selling weapons to the cartels and stuff back over the border. That's a huge footprint. You're saying that we can't take any of that down? And so the so-called war on drugs has failed because our partners were coerced into it, because they were not given the right mentality, the right intelligence. We don't trust them enough with our sacred intelligence, but also because we have not fought the fight in the United States.
Speaking of failed policies, I want to turn to Cuba. We've discussed the embargo, which has been in place for more than 6 decades now. There's been reporting in recent days in places like DropSite that suggests the Trump administration is turning its attention to Cuba and amping up military planning for such a conflict. What do you make of this noise, and what does Trump want? Does it differ from what Marco Rubio, for example, wants?
That's a good question, and we could start with that. And that is, Marco Rubio has built his credentials in Florida, which is his major political base, on being anti-Cuba or anti-Castro. Even though his family left before the revolution, I don't think he's ever been to Cuba, but he is very, very committed to regime change in Cuba. It's sort of been his number one issue. And other things have gotten in the way, like Iran and all. So I think with him, it's very easily regime change. I think with Trump would love to have a regime change, but when Trump realized 2 things, it did seem to be, whoa, let's go a little bit slower on this. One, I think he now realizes that Cuba is not Venezuela. Venezuela is a rentier economy whose politics have always been defined. Since oil was discovered 100-something years ago, has always been defined of who controls the trough, who controls the money in there. And that they're not institutionalists. They're culturally not institutionalists, except perhaps the armed forces, because their government has always been this group of people that would basically just share on the greed and corruption. Back before Chavez, it was called Punto Fijo, which was an alternation of the two things. And you take what you can, and then it's my turn. Get out of my way. I take what I can. Cuba's different. First of all, it's not a rentier economy. They don't have oil. They don't have anything. They have sunshine to do tourism, but you can't monopolize the sunshine the same way you can oil. And the Cubans also culturally, even though they're great partiers, the best rum, the best dancing, the best music and stuff, they're great partiers. They're also, and they're very verbal, and they don't hold back in their criticism of anything. They're very verbal. They're very expressive. So despite those cultural attributes, that stereotypes that might be partial, but are accurate insofar as they look at those things, Cubans are actually institutionalists. They're legalists. And so instead of violating the law, maybe they'll write the law in a way that you don't like, but they are institutionalists and legalists. And so they have actually a political party that makes actually decisions. And one could say, I don't want to sound too generous, that their economic policies have been woefully behind the times. They haven't even done reforms that they promised they would do in 2011. Was because instead of having a strong central leader or 2 or 3 people leadership, they're trying to do things by consensus, by committee, which is a weakness that in getting action done. But it's a strength if somebody wants to come in and kidnap you, that they can't just kidnap one person. They can't kidnap 2 people, 3 people, 4 people. There's actually a party, and there's actually a military. Now, you could disagree with a lot of what the military does. You could do that. But this is a military that, more than any other Latin American military, is, they say, metido con el pueblo, is in with the people. And they know what's happening in the country, and they have some support. They have some support. Now, are the Cuban people today miserable? Yes, they are. I would argue that before the most recent amping of U.S. sanctions, including the oil blockade that we now put in place, most Cubans would blame the Cuban government for the situation, for A, failing to do the reforms that they could do, and B, really getting the gringo, to the Yankee, to come to the table and, let's talk about things and stuff. But now I think it's pretty fair to say, even though they have a false choice, that false choice is either you die under the Cuban government, or you let us come in and set up a new government. That's a false choice, though, because in the end, they're not going to do that. Even though that's the case, that false choice, Cubans are now increasingly blaming the United States for their predicament, because what we have done with the so-called extreme measures or maximum pressure measures, and we've done which Joe Biden was part of. And you might even remember that during the Biden administration, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there were people from the White House, the NSC, who publicly said on Telemundo and Univision to audiences in the Latin American world, saying, moreover, the sanctions that we're doing against Russia, we're fine-tuning them to maximize the penalty for Cuba and Venezuela. Whoa, that's a lot. And so the Cubans now, I think, know. They want relief from the pain. They want reforms. So if we go back now to Trump v. Rubio, Trump would be satisfied with a bunch of economic reforms. He's not going to care as much. And he knows that if they break the government, they achieve their goal, their long goal of regime collapse and what they call failed state, that the humanitarian disaster and resulting mass migration would force U.S. actions that they don't want to do. Okay? They just don't want to do it. That I think he would say, yeah, let's do some economic reforms, put them on a path, knowing that a country that has no breathing room isn't going to find the space for democracy. But I think Marco Rubio and his people still, it's ideologically driven and politically driven rather than analytically driven, are prepared to take that risk. And so military planning, perhaps, I'm sure they've already, Southcom has said they were doing military plans, but we've been doing military planning against Cuba for a zillion years.
The problems that you've indicated with U.S. strategy also tie back to a central theme of the United States overestimating how much leverage it actually has, whether weaponizing, cutting off the flow of oil, standing up political parties and opposition and things like that. There's a theory of coercion, suffering, and political change that goes back to Eisenhower in his statements regarding the initial enactment of the embargo of, we're going to starve the people and they're going to rise up and overthrow the government. And that hasn't happened. So what do you think Washington just still misunderstands the most about that theory?
I think Washington perennially, almost proudly does not understand, fails to understand other people's nationalism. And we're very proud of our ignorance of history as well. And nationalism and history are closely tied. And it's not just the indoctrination of boys and girls in grade school, Yankees are bad. There are historical documents that people show. And we really have trouble, even with our own nationalism. Is our own nationalism chanting, we're number one, USA? Or is our nationalism pride also and love for our checks and balances, for our success, our ingenuity, our ability to be inclusive and welcome, for example, foreigners, whether they're laborers that do our gardens, take care of our kids, make our hamburgers, or scientists attracted to our great universities. Americans just don't understand how it is. So right now, it's ironic that people who say that they're putting America first are, in the view of many people, and myself included, are abandoning what our real true strengths are. So if you don't understand the other guy's nationalism and your own nationalism, don't understand and don't respect, don't even acknowledge, and you don't even study the history. I've dealt with people who are, quote, experts on certain Latin America issues where I've had to, over the years of my jobs, learn quite a bit. So they don't know some of the basics of what we've done. Like on Cuba, most Americans, including our diplomats and intelligence officers, have no idea what the so-called Platt Amendment is. Platt Amendment was a blueprint for U.S. domination of Cuba after the Cuban War of Independence. It was the document to take that independence away. And so if we don't know the basics, but every Cuban does know, and it's not just indoctrination. Yes, there's always some indoctrination going on. So if you don't know that, then you're going to step on the same raw nerves over and over again. We also don't understand that most conflicts and confrontations are ultimately political, and that we could have the biggest weapons thing and the coolest drones, and we have the great technology that we can be a zillion miles away and blow up somebody's bedroom or their car or something, but that actually life is much more political. That's why we lose in Vietnam, we lose in Afghanistan, we lose in Iraq, and we're afraid we're losing in Iran as well. You have to understand that other people don't see the world as we do, and they'll fight for their view.
One of the characteristics of the Trump administration has been the rise of a lot of what I've seen people call kind of the South Florida clique. A lot of people from South Florida, base of support for the president, base of support, as you mentioned, for Secretary Rubio, but also Mike Waltz, also Susie Wiles, a bunch of other folks who their formative political experience was in the cutthroat world of South Florida politics. And then you also have a different, what appears to be a different, based on the polling that we've seen from places like the Florida International University's Gordon Institute, a different trend in who is coming from Cuba, in particular, and Latin America in general, to the United States and their attitudes on U.S. policy. The sort of Obama opening was predicated on the idea that a lot of the migrants from Cuba to the United States and the Cuban American community was open to more moderate approach that prioritized things like opening up the Cuban economy over radical political change and toppling the government. Whereas the mass migration that has ensued in the past decade or half decade at least, we've almost seen a snapback effect where there's been more of a radicalization of South Florida politicians. So I'm curious, with the relative, seemingly less institutionalization of some of these key institutions like the Cuban American National Foundation that were so prominent in the Reagan administration and the fights in Capitol Hill over things like Helms-Burton. How strong is the South Florida, regime change lobby? And, what do you make of efforts to counter it? Are we further away from a real alternative now than we were during the Obama administration?
I think we are now for a couple of reasons, because of the strength and political effectiveness, not policy effectiveness, but the political effectiveness of what the Trump people have been doing. Yes. But also, and I would say perhaps even a greater factor, was the weakness of the Democrats, including Joe Biden. The weakness that he didn't even defend policies that were instituted when he was vice president. And he tried to out-Trump Trump. And he had junior staff with very little experience in the trenches in Latin America and really looking at it. And of course, no experience in Cuba. He had nobody who really had worked on the Cuba issue. And so they thought it was very facile. And this is a mistake that Bill Clinton made as well. When you take campaign people and you then put them into positions where they have to make real decisions, or Bill Clinton made the mistake in bringing a person who really didn't know Cuba, but thought that he could be, cooler than cool by all I have to do is kiss up to the Miami community and I'll be fine. And what happened is then we had a shoot down. The Cubans shot down planes, which many countries would have shot down as well. We would have shot down because it had overflown the city, et cetera, et cetera. We can debate that later on if you want. But it's the weakness of the Democrats. And people want to follow a leader. When Barack Obama, when Bill Clinton started the concept of people to people, get the governments out of the way, let the people do it. Cuban Americans were okay with that. And Al Gore, who later ran for president, did not suffer because of that. He did suffer because of the repatriation of the little boy, Elian Gonzalez. He did suffer, but not because of the broader policies. And so if you lead, Barack Obama led on Cuba, and Miami followed. A lot of Miami followed. People began supporting businesses that their relatives wanted to open. They began doing sort of stuff. But the moment that you cower in the corner, who's going to follow you? Especially in a rough and tumble politically and highly personalistic society like in Miami. So I think that's the broader problem. As for what's happening within the diaspora, there have been changes. You remember the people who came in the 60s, and we created the so-called Miami community. We, the United States government. First, it was done by the intelligence people because of Bay of Pigs, and then they always had their special access to the U.S. government. We gave them the most incredibly advantageous law, the Cuba Adjustment Act, that any one of them coming, even through illegal channels, could get a green card very easily within 1 year and stuff, no questions asked. And then we did a series of things. It was the Reagan administration that was meeting with the quite impressive, charismatic leader of Jorge Mas Canosa and said, you guys really should meet up with AIPAC and learn how to do Washington politics. And so Cuban American National Foundation had influence, palanca, way beyond its real true scope. And then in come the politicians who really don't have to know the issue. They simply have to know the demands. So we're sort of stuck now.
Yeah, it raises a lot of questions about how diplomacy can come to be in the American political system that I think we're all reflecting on, and specifically the role of a motivated president who is versed in the issue and determined to lead a coalition and then, rather than kind of waiting for something to happen at the congressional level or waiting for a crisis to come into being, somebody who has to be kind of motivated and to be willing to expend the political capital to make it happen.
Yeah.
Turning briefly back to Venezuela, I know we've kind of touched on it quite a bit, but
Yeah. It's an important issue because it's the first real, true, tangible Donroe Doctrine policy that we've seen.
Yeah, and what do you make of the first, we're almost up to the 4-month mark of Delcy Rodriguez and the Trump administration's policies? You know, the thing that I think stood out to a lot of us was, okay, if what the United States wants is effectively a regime management approach where they put in somebody who's going to kind of do what they want, how long will that survive until first contact with the indigenous politics? And I mean indigenous not in the sense of people, you know, whose roots trace back to period, but rather to the politics of that country. How's that playing out?
At first, a lot of us in Washington knew Delcy, and would talk to Delcy when she would come up here, and were not at all surprised that she was her role in even the Maduro era was to be the pragmatist. She was the one that would meet with the oil companies. She was the one that would meet with U.S. diplomats, etc. And in the beginning, what she could see, and her argument, public argument, which we can wonder how accurate it was that they essentially put a gun to her head, not physically, but essentially said, what has happened to Maduro will happen to you if you don't play with us. I think that now we can say she might have even given signals. I don't know if she had been a recruited asset. I don't know any of that stuff. But at first, when we looked at the agenda, there were really no big surprises because what she was prepared to do, open up for U.S. investment, change the taxation thing, those were all, and talk about political prisoners, all those things were things that Maduro wanted to do. And Maduro knew, and she knew, that we were never going to talk to Maduro because this had become a personal grudge match. It was all about him and our hatred for him, our rejection of the man. And we began to believe that he was incapable of delivering and stuff. So we deal then with Delcy. So you have your first round, second round, third round. Then you say, hey, wait a second. Now she's purging people. She's purging people. And the analytical question is, she's purging some Maduro's people, but is she also going to be purging Chavez's people? Because you know that a lot of the true blue Chavistas were not Maduristas. They tolerated him by default, but they really didn't feel that he was overly effective. If she goes after the Chavistas, then we're going to hit that, what did you call it, a reality or of the domestic struggle. That's going to happen because the Chavismo, whether we like it or not every aspect of it was 1,000,000% legitimate, but Chavismo was authentic and had legitimate historical and analytical roots. It was almost a necessary change because the old alternation of power was excluding massive parts of the society, was hugely undemocratic. Don't think that before 1998 this was a real true functioning democracy and stuff. And if they do go after the Chavez base, then people are going to wonder, wait, even the simple things that we've achieved under Chavez now have to be flushed away. So I think that's what's going to happen. How far will she go? I don't know. But she's gone farther and more freely, in other words, with very little opposition, than some of us had thought in the first days, back after January 3. That's when we did it, right? January 3 or 4.
I believe so. I believe it was the 3rd. One last country I would say to turn to, because I feel almost remiss if we didn't talk about it, is Mexico. And there was a lot of speculation about whether Trump would take the fight to the cartels in terms of, airstrikes on Mexico, whether the relationship with Claudia Sheinbaum, the current president, would be really contentious. And it seems like she's been able to navigate it kind of as her predecessor, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, did. And Trump, maybe, I've seen theories that he wanted to do sort of these airstrikes on Mexico, but then once he realized that Sheinbaum wasn't going to play ball in that, was going to tolerate that it was going to have, a lot more risks than the boat strike campaign was, then he turned to the boat strike campaign. So how would you describe the nature of the relationship between Trump and Sheinbaum right now?
Tense, but she is clever. And she has charm. She has a strategic view, more strategic and easier to swallow for Americans than AMLO, her predecessor, was. She's very clever. Remember when he changed the name of the Gulf of Mexico? Then in her next mañanera, these morning press things that she does, she has this great big map of North America behind her where, I don't know, at least a third of what we call the United States today, maybe even a half of the United States today, was called Mexico. And she says, okay, if we want to go back, if we want to change names, let's change this name as well. She's very clever. On the drugs thing, of course, she doesn't want there to be unilateral or even joint military activities, because I don't think that, and one could say that it's up to the U.S. to win her confidence. I don't think she has confidence in us, because we do hanky-panky when we go into some other country and we start doing this sort of stuff. And they start collecting intel and doing things based on the intel that we don't deign to share with the local government. You might have seen in today's newspapers and yesterday's newspapers that she's calling for an investigation into the 2 Americans that were in the car that crashed up near Chihuahua. And so far, the lead is that the U.S. Embassy, which is head purely coincidentally by a former CIA employee, the ambassador worked for CIA for a short while in his career. And so if the U.S. Embassy coordinated with the state up there, Chihuahua, maybe it's Chihuahua State, and cut the federals out of the conversation, forgetting, I guess, that they're representatives to the government of Mexico, the federal government of Mexico. And she's going to investigate. It's, of course, tragic that 2 people died. Also, 2 Mexicans were in the car and they died as well. But is she now going to become suspicious? She's also clever in that she does do stuff that is manageable. She did the raid on El Mencho. Remember, they got El Mencho in a big firefight and all that, and she had to put up with several days of retaliatory violence, very vicious violence, but she did it, and she sustained the violence and stuff. So she's pretty clever, but it's going to be a very tense relationship, in part because she's not going to do certain things, and also in part because she's clever. And sometimes we Americans don't like clever foreigners.
Fulton Armstrong, thank you for sharing your insights and coming on Security Dilemma today.
My pleasure. Congratulations on your great work.
Security Dilemma is a podcast by the John Quincy Adams Society. To learn more about our programs, visit our website at jqas.org. Remember to rate and review on your podcast app and join us every Tuesday for new episodes of Security Dilemma.